The wildlife updates presented today will be effective as of June 18, 2018. This recorded presentation will cover EPMG updates, Environmental Information Management System updates, and review the use of all Commission wildlife tools in a scenario training environment. These updates presented today are as a result of the Commission's commitment to providing transparent and consistent guidance for applicants and decision makers alike. In July of 2017, the Commission introduced planning and operational measures and the Environmental Information Management System. Since then, we've received some internal and external feedback, and the updates presented today are a result of clarification and fine-tuning of these processes. Let's start with the EPMG updates. The EPMG has been all over edited and updated for increased readability. Our planning and operational measures for riparian areas, fisheries-sensitive watersheds, old growth management areas, and resource features have been updated for clarity and to be less prescriptive. The Commission's high priority wildlife decision-making process and the wildlife habitat feature setback process have both been updated. First, let's talk about the high priority wildlife determination process. As indicated, this process was updated and has now been included in the EPMG to help applicants and decision makers alike understand which species are designated high priority wildlife and why. For a full review of this, go to section 1.6.3 or Appendix D of the EPMG. Next, I'm going to do a quick walkthrough of the high priority wildlife determination process using a much asked about species. That's western toad. We're often asked whether western toad is on the high priority wildlife list, and if not, why not? So here we'll show you why. Starting step, is this species identified in an OGA ministerial order for categories of species at risk and or categories of ungulate? And the answer for western toad is no. In that case, we then move on and ask, is this species a red or blue listed species? Western toad has been downgraded to yellow, so it is not on the list. But just for information's sake, let's say it still was a red or blue listed species. In that case, we would move down and filter to see if this species was ranked as priority 1, 2, or 3 for any of the 3 goals on the BC Conservation Framework. If no, then it would fall off the list. If yes, we would then filter further for species requiring habitat protection or restoration as identified by action groups of the BC Conservation Framework. If no, it would not be on the list. If yes, it would fall on our high priority wildlife list. As a result of this update, the high priority wildlife list has greatly increased. The list is now 333 species from a previous 138. What's important for oil and gas people to note is that 46 high priority wildlife species are located in Northeast BC. The list has been updated for readability as well. We have now split the list into geographic regions. We have a listing specific to those species that occur within Northeast BC, and we also have a listing for species that occur outside of Northeast BC. Obviously, when a species is found in both, it is in both lists. The list has also been further divided for classification and ease of use. It is now divided into vertebrates, invertebrates, plants and lichens, and plant communities. Again, this list can be found in 1.6.3 or Appendix D of the EPMG. Next, let's talk about the BC OGC hierarchy of external guidance. This process has both been updated and included in the EPMG. The purpose of including it in the EPMG is to share with industry the process by which the Commission consistently considers the use of the multitudes of provincial wildlife guidance when developing oil and gas specific wildlife guidance. This flowchart is available in 1.6.1 of the EPMG. And I think what's key about this hierarchy is it will tell you how and why we get to the oil and gas wildlife guidance that we deliver to each and every application, and ensures that industry and decision makers are on the same page for which guidance would be applicable to their particular application. Next, we're going to talk about the application of planning and operational measures for wildlife. Firstly, all wildlife guidance is now located within EIMS. The BC Oil and Gas Commission Planning and Operation Consideration process clearly outlines the steps for consideration when an application impacts a wildlife value. So what steps should you follow to understand which planning and operational measures are applicable to your application? Well, first of all, planning and operational measures are available for wildlife habitat areas and ungulate winter ranges, as well as all the high priority wildlife vertebrates in Northeast BC. A quick example will show how a typical application proceeds through the review process with no additional requirements. So if your application is in Northeast BC, then we know that there will be EIMS available, EIMS, Environmental Information, Planning and Operational Measures, available for the wildlife, species, or area under order that your application might be impacting. So using a WHA as an example, we're going to say your WHA is in Northeast BC. The expectation is you will go to EIMS and you will look for the planning and operational measures applicable to your application. Also, you will need to know the status of the ABA polygon in which your application is impacting. So in this case, we're saying the application is normal, so you proceed, your application must adhere to the planning and operational measures outlined in EIMS for that particular WHA, in which case you would just submit your application. Obviously, if your application is unable to adhere to the planning and operational measures, at that time you would be prompted to submit a rationale. And we'll go through these in scenarios, which will help make it clear for everyone. Next, wildlife habitat features. The Commission received both internal and external feedback on wildlife habitat feature setback requirements that were delivered in our 2017 Planning and Operational Measures introduction. Since then, we have taken both internal and external feedback and revised. The revisions clarify what is defined as a wildlife habitat feature, and in this case, it is high priority wildlife dens. That means grizzly fisher and wolverine dens, significant mineral licks and wallows, and high priority wildlife nests of birds exhibiting nest fidelity, so they return to the same nest. Also, the Commission has clearly identified when pre-work setback areas might be considered, and those would be in areas of identified wildlife habitat, so areas where it has been identified that this species is more likely to be. So wildlife habitat features would be more likely to be located in areas of known wildlife habitat, such as a wildlife habitat area or an ungulate winter range or a CDC polygon. We've gone further to describe where we have higher expectations, that would be in large CDC polygons and UWRs. The expectation is not that you will blankly consider the whole CDC polygon or whole UWR as identified wildlife habitat, but that if your application is in an area where species key habitat features have been identified, in that case, this is called identified habitat and pre-work surveys may be required. So we have further identified what a wildlife habitat feature is, but we've also gone further and clarified what setbacks are applied. And these setbacks have been revised to reflect Specifically, oil and gas activity impacts, the timing of your impact, and of course, as we said earlier, proximity to identified habitat. There is more information in section 1.9 of the EPMG on this. Also, we will go through a wildlife habitat features setback requirement in a WHA in one of our scenarios. Next, we're going to move on to the Environmental Information Management System. This has been updated based on industry and internal feedback and to streamline and update our processes. Firstly, our homepage was updated to provide clarity around application of guidance, definitions, and version control. As we move into version 2 of EIMS, it's important that we have a mechanism for documenting versions, as when you indicate that your application adheres to the Environmental Protection Management Guideline, you are indicating that your application also adheres to the planning and operational measures available in EIMS at the time of your application submission. So the version at the time of your application submission is what the Commission will hold you accountable to. Our species search function remains the same. You still have two options. You have the side scroll. You can scroll through our listing of high priority wildlife species, or you can type in at the top in our species search. Please remember that the species search is not spelling forgiving, so unless you know exactly how to spell your species, you may be better off searching through, scrolling down our small list. Wildlife habitat feature and ungulate winter ranges have been slightly changed in their search function. On the side search, you can access any wildlife habitat area or ungulate winter range located in Northeast BC. For each of these, there is a summary of oil and gas specific guidance. On the bottom search bar, you will be linked to any UWR or WHA in BC. However, only those in Northeast BC contain oil and gas specific guidance. And this brings us to probably the biggest change that EIMS has undertaken. The Commission has determined that given that over 90% of our applications received are in Northeast BC Region 9, we're best off focusing EIMS on Northeast BC so we can provide more fulsome guidance. So with that said, EIMS has been revised to fully focus on Northeast BC. We now have high priority wildlife species for Northeast BC vertebrates, all included in the EIMS. We also have all the wildlife habitat areas and ungulate winter ranges for Northeast BC included in our EIMS system. In doing so, we added an additional 17 summaries for high priority wildlife for vertebrates that are found in Northeast BC. We also updated all of the other high priority wildlife species in and removed the non-Northeast species located in EIMS. With that said, timing windows for species within Northeast BC will be found in EIMS. Applicants will refer to and apply guidance found within EIMS for all oil and gas activity within Northeast BC. Compliance with timing windows noted within EIMS does not negate the proponent's responsibility to consider and plan riparian works and/or stream crossings within a least risk window for aquatic species in the Peace Region. Also, the expectation is that applicants will also adhere to all other applicable legislation. So, operations within Northeast BC will refer to EIMS guidance, whereas operations outside of Northeast BC will require regional specific guidance and direction from a QP. Additional communication with regional offices and references to other regional specific documents may be required in addition to the resources noted in the EPMG. What's key here is if your application is impacting a wildlife species that is located outside of Northeast BC, you will be required to submit a mitigation strategy. As a note, this is a frequently asked question. An application comes in, and for example, it could be in the Skeena region, but the species impacted would be grizzly bear. Does that mean you would use the planning and operational measures located in EIMS for grizzly bear in Northeast BC? And the answer is no. If your application is for an activity located outside of Northeast BC, you must submit that mitigation strategy with region-specific guidance. The POMs in EIMS are Northeast BC specific. Okay, that about sums up our updates. Now let's go through the training scenarios where we'll revisit the planning and operational measures and the environmental information management system and how they fit into the application process. We like using scenarios because we've had some good feedback from people indicating that going through the full application scenario really helps them understand how environmental information management system and planning and operational measures feed into their application process. So for our first scenario, we're going to keep it simple. We're going to look at a pipeline application that intersects a riparian area. Here I'm showing your application review being done in ArcGIS. Obviously, you, however, will use the mapping tool of your choice to undertake your application review. Regardless of what mapping tool you use, you will see that the proposed application does indeed overlap a riparian area. And if we look a little closer, we can see that it is a riparian area ABA status normal. So because this riparian area is in Northeast BC and our ABA status is normal, this means it's a routine application and the riparian planning and operational measures will apply. So you will need to go to the EPMG where you can find riparian planning and operational measures. As you can see, our table looks, this is actually a copy, a screenshot of the table right out of the EPMG. You can see the objectives is to maintain a fully functioning riparian management area, and we want to minimize impacts to stream temp, shade, bank stability, channel characteristics, pool depth and volume, wildlife habitat, sediment filtering, runoff control, and biodiversity. Some of the ways we're expecting this to happen, and this planning and operational measure has been updated to ensure that it provides some great ways to meet the objectives identified, but it is not prescriptive. So we're hoping that you will plan to utilize existing disturbance and limit new cut. Where possible, minimize your right-of-way width. And in your operational activities, expecting to limit the removal of timber and vegetation, obviously avoid grubbing and avoid or minimize impacts to root mat and duff. And take the measures appropriate to your activity and terrain to limit erosion. Obviously, it's going to be weather dependent, site dependent. The Commission isn't specifically asking you to do one or several of these types of erosion control. We're asking you to ensure that you're utilizing the appropriate and most effective version for erosion control at your site. And upon completion of your activity, we're asking that you undertake measures to control access if appropriate and promote natural or assisted regeneration. These measures are to encourage the reestablishment of the pre-existing ecological trajectory. So that being said, if your application is able to adhere to the riparian planning and operational measures as indicated in the EPMG, in AMS, in the Stewardship tab, you will be asked, does the application adhere to the environmental protection and management guideline? In this case, if your application meets the planning and operational measures, then you would indicate yes, and nothing further would be required. Your application would be submitted. If your application does not adhere to the planning and operational measures and you need to do separate activities in order to meet the objectives outlined in the riparian planning and operational measures, then you would indicate, no, you can't meet the planning and operational measures, and you will be prompted to upload your rationale, which will be prepared by a QP, and tell the Commission how you will meet the riparian objectives through another strategy. And that is the end of scenario 1. The next scenario is a well application intersecting a CDC polygon for black-throated green warbler. In this, we're going to show you the application created in AMS, and we're going to upload our shapefile, and you can see this well application is intersecting a polygon, and we're going to use our analysis tool to access information on what this wildlife polygon is. So when we do that, we can see that this is indeed a CDC polygon for black-throated green warbler. We know that this application is in Northeast BC. So black-throated green warbler is a high-priority wildlife species. It's located in Northeast BC, so that means planning and operational measures apply. And because this is in Northeast BC, this information will be located in EIMS. So we would go into EIMS and we would scroll down and search out our black-throated green warbler and pull up our planning and operational measures for black-throated green warbler. Here you can see planning measures, operational measures, and importantly, we have objectives and key habitat features. So let's have a look at those objectives and key habitat features. So this is key for planning our application or our review process. We need to know what we're trying to protect here. So the objectives of this CDC polygon are to minimize disturbance during the breeding season and maintain that nesting habitat at all times. So maintaining a desired plant community and key habitat features. So what are the key habitat features for black-throated green warbler? I think we can skim through this and see mature forest in large, so greater than 2 hectare patches is really key. We also want dense low shrubbery and understory. Again, mixed mature forest adjacent to riparian areas. So we've sort of identified here some really key habitat features. So when we go into this large CDC polygon, we're going to be able to say, these are the habitat features we're trying to protect in this area. Not the entire CDC polygon, but these key habitat features. So a trick for identifying some of these key habitat features in the mapping phase is if we know this habitat feature that we're trying to protect is mature forest, the ABA old forest layer can be overlaid with our shapefile, and we can see that indeed our application is going to fragment a significant chunk of contiguous mature forest. So depending on the locational flexibility of your activity at this time, you might want to consider moving it out of the key habitat into what looks to be potentially an already cleared area. And that way you would be potentially meeting the planning and operational measures. So we've asked you to plan, obviously, to time your works outside of the critical window. We're asking you to plan to minimize impacts to key habitat features like large forest patches and areas adjacent to riparian areas, and avoid sensitive areas such as nesting and foraging habitat. So we plan this and then we undertake our operational activities. So we're undertaking construction and operations of oil and gas activities in a manner that minimizes impacts to those desired plants, communities, and key habitat features. So if we've been unable to avoid them, we want to maybe minimize the amount of impact we're having on those areas. And we definitely want to avoid disturbance and or clearing activities during the critical timing window. If you are planning to work within the critical timing window, you are not meeting the planning and operational measures, and you will need to submit a rationale. So again, if you can meet the planning and operational measures, so we're maintaining old forest habitat and we are working outside the timing windows, then we would just simply indicate that yes, our application adheres to the environmental protection and management guidelines, and your application would be submitted as such. If you are unable to, check no and upload your rationale. So that ends that scenario, but it also brings up a really good frequently asked question. So we've had a number of applications that come in a large CDC polygon, and in the area that the applicant is looking to put their activity, there are no key habitat features present. In fact, in some of these cases, they're looking to put it, there's a clear cut, there's definitely not any mature forest. And they say, planning and operational measures don't apply. And we say, yes, planning and operational measures always apply in areas of identified wildlife habitat. So if you're in a WHA, a UWR, or a CDC polygon, the planning and operational measures do apply, even if there's no key habitat features. In that case, what you need to determine is, does the application adhere to the planning and operational measures? And given that there is no habitat to impact, very likely your activity is not impacting key habitat features. However, if you're hoping to do your activity within the normal critical timing window, you would have to submit a rationale. You've had a QP out there to tell you that this is not warbler or fisher habitat, whatever high priority wildlife species we're talking about. In this case, if you're in a CDC polygon, a WHA, or a UWR, you will need to submit that rationale telling us that there is no key habitat, that you're able to work within that window without impacting nesting or denning because there are no trees there is no chance of impact, and you would submit that with your application, and that would be the end of the process. But do POMs apply if there is no key habitat features present in a proposed application area? The answer is yes, they do apply if it is in an area of identified habitat. So let's move on to scenario 3. This is our last scenario for this presentation, and it really showcases planning and operational measures, environmental information management system, and how ABA wildlife all work together. So our scenario is going to be a geophysical application intersecting with a fisher WHA that is in ABA regulatory policy status. So again, I'm showing this using ArcGIS, and you can indeed see that the hash there of geophysical application is overlapping a wildlife polygon of some sort. So from there we use our tools and we can determine that this wildlife or this polygon is indeed a WHA 9-100. So it's a fisher WHA in the middle Kiskatna River area, and our ABA status is in regulatory policy. So as soon as we know it's in Northeast BC, we then know that EIMS information and guidance will be available, and also that ABA is applicable. So here we are, we need to go to EIMS, and we need to look at the planning and operational measures, and we also need to look at the ABA escalated requirements. First, just to quickly answer some questions we've had coming in there. You can see in this slide that we have a BCGW, UWR, and an ABA WHA. And that is because they look slightly different, and that's because they are. The ABA small WHAs are slightly larger than the BCGWs, and that's because ABA puts a small 100-meter buffer around these WHAs that are under 100 hectares, because in Northeast BC, these WHAs under 100 hectares are for species like fishers and warblers that are very edge sensitive. So this allows us to do a little bit of edge impact management through ABA. So again, we said this was fisher WHA in regulatory policy. We know that it's in Northeast BC, so we're going to go to EIMS, and we're going to search our WHA 9-100, and we're going to pull that up and see what our management objectives are for this area. So why was this area under order created? What is it trying to protect? And what our oil and gas planning and operational measures are to protect this area. So first, this area under order was established to conserve fisher and fisher habitat and to prevent human disturbance, motorized access, and construction in this area. Also, its intent is to maintain forested areas, especially those in proximity of riparian zones, and retain that fisher habitat of coarse woody debris, understory shrub cover, standing deadfall, and to minimize impacts and disturbance during the denning season, April to June. So how do we take those management objectives and put them into some oil and gas planning and operational measures? Well, very simply, this is a small WHA, and our planning measures for this area are quite fulsome. Our preference in this area would be avoidance. So we're looking to have you plan for no roads or trails or motorized access in this area. If at all possible, no impacts to forest cover. We don't want to see water development in this area, no dugouts. And we don't actually permit pesticides, so that would be done through FLNRO, but the intent of this area is not to use pesticides, and we really want to minimize any impacts during April to June when fishers will be denning. But as we noted, this area is also ABA status regulatory policy, and this means that there is further escalated application requirements associated. So because this is a regulatory policy application, it will automatically trigger what's called an enhanced review process. So that means there will be a stewardship staff expert come in and review the impacts to wildlife in this case. And also there will be higher level decision makers involved in reviewing the application and decision outcome as well. And so this can increase the timelines for turnaround of your application. Also, because any application for oil and gas activity within an ABA polygon of any sort in enhanced management or regulatory policy will immediately trigger a mitigation strategy requirement. It will be triggered through AMS. So those are the expectations that we have with that. And then lastly, this is where I will get a chance to show you how wildlife habitat features would apply in here as well. So our 6D of the PMR is wildlife habitat feature, setback requirements, and protection. And this is a separate but complementary requirement for environmental protection under the EPMR. So here, because you're also in an area of identified wildlife habitat, the Commission's expectation is a pre-fieldwork survey will be undertaken to identify presence, absence of wildlife habitat features within the applicable setback distance. So this is geophysical. So depending on if you're hoping to have your seismic activity in this area during the denning period or outside of it. So if you're outside the denning period, it would be 100 meters setback or survey requirements from your seismic planned area, or 250 if you're planning to be within the denning features. So, and that is because in these areas of identified wildlife habitats, specifically for fisher, wolverine, grizzly, where we have identified that their dens are definitely designated as wildlife habitat features, the expectation is that you'll ensure that activity in identified wildlife habitat does not impact these. So presence absence field survey, and if a wildlife habitat feature is located in that presence absence survey, then there will be specific setback requirements applied. So I hope that summarizes all of our updates well, and that allows people to understand how we're applying these. So in AMS, you would now confirm that your application impacts an ABA regulatory policy area, in which case you will be immediately prompted to upload your mitigation strategy. And next, you would need to indicate, does your application adhere to the environmental protection and management guidelines? So you would indicate yes, and your application would be sent through review. So scenarios are concluded, and this pretty much wraps up this presentation. I'll just do a bit of a summary of what we covered today. We've covered planning and operational measures. They've been updated to be a bit more streamlined, a little less prescriptive, but they continue to summarize what the Commission's expectations are for oil and gas activities impacting environmental values that have been identified under the Environmental Protection Management Regulation. Also updated high priority wildlife determination process has clearly clarified which species are on the high priority wildlife list and why. It's now available in the EPMG. And we've also provided in the EPMG the updated hierarchy of external wildlife guidance, which outlines the Commission's processes for utilizing external wildlife guidance and documentation sources. EIMS, our Environmental Information Management System, has been updated to focus on providing guidance for application areas within Northeast BC. And we've also updated our wildlife habitat feature setback guidance to provide clarity around what would be considered a wildlife habitat feature and expectations for protection, as well as a definition of identified wildlife habitat. Thank you for listening to this presentation. We hope that if you have any feedback, comments, questions, that you will send them our way here at servicedesk@bcogc.ca. That's how we can continually improve our support services for applications. Thank you.